Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining our special session today. It's my pleasure to introduce my former colleague and mentor, Dr. David Laude. He's a professor of chemistry at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also a distinguished teaching professor and a member of their teaching academy. He's the former senior vice provost for enrollment and graduation management. And during his time in that role, he improved the University of Texas at Austin's four-year graduation rate from 52% to 66%. And even more impressively, the Pell eligible graduation rate from 40% to over 60%. So those huge improvements in his graduation rate, I'm really excited to learn from him today about what he did there. David has a PhD from the University of California at Riverside in chemistry. His research was focused in mass spectrometry. A special fact, David grew up in Modesto. Back when he was in high school, I found out that he even drove a truck delivering parts within the canneries and farms in the region. David and I have talked. He's really excited to be here at Merced, though he is still a little bitter that the Merced campus isn't actually in Modesto, which he was advocating for as a resident of the Valley. David was also the 2019 winner of the University of Texas Regents Awards for Outstanding Teaching Professor. He also has more teaching awards, advising excellence awards, and Young Investigator Awards to his name than I can enumerate here today. It's my pleasure to introduce David Laude, who will be telling us about the student success initiatives he led at UT Austin. Thank you, David.
Well, thanks, Sarah. And I never thought I was like a mentor to you. I always thought of us as being kindred spirits. I'm sitting down with you the first time I met with you and thought, oh my goodness, she puts students first. This is such an exciting thing. I'm thrilled to be here for a variety of reasons. I always love giving this talk to folks, especially to folks who are interested in seeing that we do everything on a college campus to make it possible for students to succeed. But it's also kind of fun because, as Sarah points out, I grew up in the Central Valley. I don't know how many of you are from the Central Valley yourself, but I lived in Modesto from age 3 to age 18 before I went off to college. And there's an awful lot about what it was like to grow up in the Central Valley in the 70s that influenced who I am today. Some of it was the fact that the circle of people that I was around, my parents' friends were ranchers and farmers and football coaches and not a lot of professionals. No doctors, no lawyers, no business people. No engineers. In fact, I have a funny story about this, which I think says a lot about how it is that I came to have an understanding of students. And this is a true story because there wasn't an internet. So what you were was what you saw as your environment around you and not much other than that. I somehow ended up at a university, the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, 2,500 miles away from Modesto, California, one of the most substantial fish out of water you'll ever meet. How I ended up there was an accident of a bunch of stuff that put me into a place where my first couple of years were really, really difficult. And so here's the story. I am minding my own business, leaving a chemistry lab my freshman year, and I'm walking out with this guy. And I said to him, so what's your major? And he said to me, I'm in a 3-2 engineering program with Columbia. And that's 7 words. And I didn't understand any of those words. I didn't know what 3-2 meant. I didn't know what Columbia meant. But I was really kind of surprised that he was studying engineering, because I didn't think that people who drove trains needed to go to college. And that's kind of a funny thing to say, but it was true. I'd had no idea that there was such a thing as an engineer when I went off to college, even though I was good at math and science. And I always have that in my mind when I think about students I talk to who grow up without access to the kinds of experiences that make them aware of what the possibilities are. And I think in many ways, as I think about my journey that took me from where I was coming out of the Central Valley and off to college to the point where I am right now, that really so much of what I've done while I've been a faculty member with respect to student success was in some ways an effort to right the wrongs that I guess I may have experienced myself when I was heading off to college. Let me say a couple of other things before I start the presentation. I am I am a chemist. I teach freshman chemistry. I teach upper division chemistry courses. When I arrived at UT Austin, my primary job was to publish enough papers and raise enough research funding and graduate enough students with PhDs that I could get tenure and then get promoted to full professor. And so a lot of what I brought to the dean's office and to the provost office as an administrator had to do with the fact that I spent a lot of time looking at numbers and making decisions in a very honoring statistics kind of way. I look at numbers and I think, what are the likelihoods of what I can achieve based upon these numbers? So I had that as a background. It is also the case that I have had no formal training whatsoever with respect to education, to educational psychology, to sociology, to any of the sorts of things that might allow me to argue that there's some sort of frame for what I did intellectually. I always joke about the fact that every decision I made with respect to student success was built on the fact that I went to mass on Sundays and my father yelled at me the rest of the week to be a good person. And so that's what I bring as well. So for those of you who do have those kinds of backgrounds and you listen to what I'm presenting, you don't at all need to think that I'm doing it with any level of sophistication. It's just me trying to think through what would work in terms of what I wanted to accomplish. So I'm going to go ahead and put the PowerPoint presentation up here for you. And then from there, I'll take you on a bit of the journey that I had. Of course, I've now failed miserably to find my PowerPoint presentation. There it is. All right, so this is actually a story that begins with politics. And the way it works is this. Back about 15 years or so ago, Rick Perry became the governor of the state of Texas. And he came from Texas A&M, which didn't exactly have the best of relationships with UT. On a certain level, we were always, like rivals with each other. And he made the decision to start putting on the Board of Regents for the UT system A&M graduates. And so there developed this kind of hostility between our Board of Regents and UT Austin and its president, Bill Powers. UT Austin had this idea in mind that it wanted to think of itself as an elite institution. And that meant we wanted to compare ourselves from a public school perspective with places like Michigan or UVA or North Carolina or Berkeley, that kind of thing. And so that's the sort of way we wanted to puff ourselves up and offer up that we were pretty special. And there were lots of good things about UT, but there was certainly one thing about UT that was not true. And that was that our students were graduating at anywhere near the rate that students were graduating from those other institutions. And how it is that it came around to this, I don't know exactly, but there came a point when Bill Powers was told that he had to get his four-year graduation rates up to 70%. And at the time, they were about 50% and had been there for several years. So he decided he was going to do something about that. And what that was to form a committee. And he had the dean of liberal arts and some other faculty come together. And they made the decision that what they were going to do was meet for a year and then offer three recommendations. The first recommendation was that they were going to improve orientation. And the second recommendation was that they were going to improve advising. And the third recommendation was that they were going to hire somebody they would call the champion of four-year graduation rates. And that person was supposed to fix it all. And I ended up being the person who was chosen to be the champion of four-year graduation rates and arrived at the provost office with that as my charge. And so I tell you this because in many ways, it was the best possible circumstances I could find myself in. First of all, there was a number I had to get. And when there's ever a number you have to get in your sciences, it's easy. You say, I'm just going to optimize what I do to get to that number. And the other thing was I absolutely had the backing of the president, so that even though lots of people didn't really think that four-year graduation rates were all that special, they did know that this was something they had to do in support of their president. And then finally, they arranged things such that the only new money that we were getting at UT from UT system was money that would come for the purpose of improving four-year graduation rate. So what do I know? I'm suddenly in the provost office and I actually have some reasonable resource with which to try to fix things. So that was all a bunch of positives that happened for me, that put me in a situation where, even though I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to do, at least most of the vectors were aligning the way I wanted them to. I should also mention that UT Austin is filled with thousands of people who come to work every day trying to make things better for students. And so even though I may have been the champion of four-year graduation rates, the reality is that lots and lots of people were champions of students. But I think what was really going on that was such a complicating issue was that the ideas people had about how to help students be successful were different from each other. And this is where I'll pull out my I'm a chemist sort of hat and tell you that in chemistry and thermodynamics, there is this distinction between something called heat and something called work. Those are the two things you can do with energy. Heat is the chaotic movement of energy, and work is when everything aligns. And so my way of looking at what was happening on the campus was that there were thousands of people who came to work every day, generating a lot of heat with respect to student success, but so very often the vectors just didn't align. And what was happening now as a consequence of there being this charge that we were supposed to fix four-year graduation rates was the idea that we all were going to work toward that end. So it became really easy for me when I would talk to different groups, whether it was the faculty or the staff or the advisors, you name it, I would say everything we're going to do has to be about making sure that four-year graduation rates improve. The other thing that mattered because of this number that we were talking about is I could put a real value on it. UT would admit about 8,000 incoming freshmen every year. And so all I had to do was take 8,000 and multiply it times 0.7 and know that 4 years later, 5,600 students had to graduate or we hadn't done our job. And this is where I also was really keen on the idea that you had to think about students as individuals and to realize that for each of those students, there was a reason that they would or would not graduate. And so I used to start talks by telling people that I was going to go out and paint the flagpole in front of the tower at UT burnt orange. And then every day I would come out to the flagpole and I would shimmy up to the top of it. And I would flick off pieces of burnt orange paint for every student who left the university. And there would be this line about 30% of the way down, which would be called the 70% line. And we had to stay north of that, make sure that at least 5,600 people graduated. And what's important to understand about that, at least as far as I was concerned, was we had never really thought about it like that. I think administrators oftentimes don't zoom in and look at the individual and ask about why they do or don't graduate. I remember going to lunch one time with the person who ran the mental health services over at UT. And I was asking him, I said, so what percentage of the students who don't graduate in 4 years do you think it's academic and what percentage is non-academic? And he would say, well, I bet about half of it's academic and I bet about half of it's non-academic. And I say, yeah, that sounds about right. And in fact, that's, I think, one of the real problems you have in administration is that we don't feel like we can dig in and work at the level of detail where it actually matters, each fleck of burnt orange paint. So instead we say, yeah, 8,000 students showed up, 4,000 students graduated in 4 years, 2,000 students didn't for academic reasons, 2,000 students didn't for non-academics, what you gonna do? And so the work that we did begin there at UT was in the end about trying to drill in individually and ask why those graduation numbers were going down. And where we saw that we could fix them, we were going to fix them. So that was a really important thing for me to understand. And that's why data became such an incredible driver for us in our efforts to be successful. And it's sort of a weird thing when you think about it, because on the one side, I've got this spreadsheet of just cold, hard numbers. And on the other hand, I have these students that I'm deeply committed to help be successful. But in the end, it's about the spreadsheet that lets us know whether we're being successful or not. And I think that that's also one of the reasons why oftentimes things get kind of confused. There's so much well-meaning that goes into student success, but if in the end they don't graduate, then all that effort maybe wasn't going to be what we needed to be able to win the game. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started and let you know. Oops, sorry about that. Well, that's too bad. It looks like it kicked all the way to the bottom. So my apologies about this. Let me get out here and get this fixed. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with this. Sorry about that. This is a presentation that's about the student-centered campus, and it's actually in two parts. The first half of it is a conversation about how UT Austin's campus came to be a very different place in terms of being student-centered. And the second half of this is about my own personal growth as a faculty member, and in fact, the way in which the faculty at UT Austin changed significantly in terms of how they approach their work with students. So to begin then, what I had to think of as I started the job in the provost office was how it was that we were going to make it possible for every student to graduate. And so then I started thinking about what the reasons why were that this didn't happen. And of course, we had this idea that we had to hit 70% graduation rate, but the campus culture was stuck at 50%. And this is an important thing to understand. I remember going to the graduation ceremony the year before I showed up in the provost office, and almost everybody who gave a talk kind of jokingly referred to graduating in 4 years and the fact that they hadn't done it. And in fact, that was pretty much what was expected on campus. Nobody really seemed to want to finish in 4 years. Maybe it was because Austin was a great place to live, or maybe people wanted to come back in the fall to watch football, or maybe people just didn't feel like there was any drive for them to get out. So everyone was accepting this. And that's why one of the interesting things I faced was, on some level, many of the faculty were against it. Many of the advisors were against it. Many of the students were against it, and we had to change that particular cultural perspective. And so there was a lot of work that went into reframing the identity of the students. They were all given a graduation year. So when I came in, the first class we were working with was a class of 2017. And the idea was that we needed to have them all graduated by then. So they were all labeled as the class of 2017 when they arrived as freshmen. The other things we had to do along that line were really to help to message to everyone, from the faculty to the advisors, that this became an essential piece of what we did. And I think that that had a significant effect. But in the end, when I started looking at the numbers, I came to realize where the real problem was. And so that's why I begin this talk by talking about the idea of belonging and helping to appreciate who the students were who came to UT. UT Austin is an interesting institution. It has the ability to admit students with extraordinary academic backgrounds. We could fill the place with 1,400, 1,500 plus SATs and very high class rankings easily. However, in the state of Texas, there is something called automatic admissions, or top 10% rule, and California has its version, but ours is very strict in our case. And it basically says that if you graduate in the top X% of your class, then you can go to whatever UT system school you want to go to. And what that meant then was that the vast majority of students used it as a reason to come to UT Austin. And there's some variations on a theme for how that all worked, but the end result is that if you look at the demographics for UT Austin, you will see that about a fourth of our students are kind of Ivy League character. They are 1,500 plus SAT, and they really can go wherever they want to go, and they came to UT either for financial reasons or personal reasons. But then there's a population, about a fourth of our students who arrive at UT who get into UT because of automatic admissions. They are the students from around the state, whether it's in the Rio Grande Valley, whether it's in an urban school, whether it's in the far reaches of East or West Texas, who only got into UT because of that rule. They show up, most of them with SAT scores of 1,000 or below. And so when they arrive on campus, it really is a place that for many of them is an extraordinary challenge in terms of feeling like they belong. And as I was to learn when I looked at the numbers, the percentage of students who were showing up on campus and feeling like they didn't belong, it was easy to identify who they were. They were the Pell-grant eligible students that came from around the state. And they were leaving the university in alarming numbers. The four-year graduation rates for this particular group was something in the low 30%, whereas for students coming from affluent, the numbers were in the 70 or 80%. And if they didn't graduate in 4 years, it was probably because they decided to do a study abroad. So I knew that what I was going to have to do if we were going to make any sort of progress was to work with that student population that felt like it wasn't comfortable coming onto campus. Just to give you a sense about what that's like, I remember, and this was actually something that was really an important moment for me. I had just come into the dean's office as a new student dean and was throwing this welcome party for incoming students to UT Austin. And I remember they had a band playing and pizza and all. I found a young woman sitting around the back corner away from it all. And I was introducing myself to her. And I had found out that she had come from the Valley and had never been in Austin before. And I asked why she chose UT. And she said, because it's the most beautiful place I've ever seen. And she did this all based upon pictures. And she was there, but obviously really uncomfortable with being there. I asked where she was living. And she told me she lived off campus with some friends in inexpensive housing. And I knew it was going to be a difficult thing for her to be successful. And I didn't feel like we had any way to actually help her to succeed. She'd get on the bus in the morning and ride for an hour to get to UT. She would go to a couple of classes and then get away from UT as fast as she could and go back to her apartment. And I wasn't surprised when it was all said and done when she ended up dropping out of the university. And I realized that that was so much a part of how it is that so many of the students felt. And in fact, it was exactly how I felt. I went off to college, to a prep school, effectively, having come from the Central Valley and not knowing how to fit in at all, and had a terrible first semester. Academically, I didn't do well. Socially, I felt like a misfit. And at the end of my first semester, when I got on the plane, my first airplane ride ever, and flew home to Modesto, California, I knew I wasn't going back. I immediately went to Modesto Junior College and signed up, and I was all certain I was just going to drop out of school and go to the junior college. On the second day of January, my father, who scared me a lot, big man, walked into my bedroom and leaned over and in this threatening voice said, "You're going back." And so I did. And it didn't get better for a long time, but that's why I went back. And then I think about all the students that were like me for whatever reason in terms of not fitting in, who didn't have somebody who encouraged them to go back, who realized that every moment they spent on campus was a moment of feeling like well, they just weren't comfortable. And I oftentimes would put it in the context of how many doors do they feel like they're comfortable walking through? None. They don't want to go to class because they feel like they don't belong there, and they don't know anybody else on this giant campus. So of course they get off campus as soon as they can. So a lot of the early initiatives that I put into place were to require that students spend as much time on campus as possible. And that's where this focus on belonging became a really important part of what we did. And the first thing we had to do was to create some sort of structure that it made it possible for these students to feel like they could be part of a community. Now, one of the issues to be faced, of course, is you never want a student population to feel like they're somehow different. So in a few minutes, you'll hear about all the success programs that were created in support of these students. But we couldn't have these students arriving on campus and being told, look, you're a student who falls in this certain category, so guess what? We're going to treat you differently from everybody else. So the first thing I did was create the opportunity for there to be these small classroom experiences once a week in which every student was part of something we called the 360 connections. The idea being that there'd be 360 of these, there'd be about 20 students in a class, 7,200 students or so altogether, all of them feeling like they belong to something. And what was nice about this was we already had so much of the infrastructure in place, it was just disorganized. It didn't matter whether you were an honor student or in a success program or in a research program or in a major. We were able to make it possible for these students to once a week show up and just be around a collection of other individuals that shared something in common with them. And what that also meant then was that when a student from a success program bumped into a student who was in an honors program, they could both talk about 360 communities, 360 connections communities, and feeling like they were all part of the same sort of thing, even if it was a different community that they were in. Once those were in place, though, I had to figure out what to do for the population of students that was least likely to graduate. And so using a bit of my statistics background and some not particularly high-level statistics, we went in and asked a very simple question. We had all this historical data at UT on who graduated in 4 years and who did not. So all we had to do was find out the likelihood that a student would graduate in 4 years. What we did was we looked at probably on the order of 15 to 20 different kinds of factors and asked, given this factor, what's your likelihood of graduating? This included everything from your academic background, the number of AP courses you had, your SAT scores, the high school you went to, excuse me. But it also had factors like how much money did your parents make? Or what particular neighborhoods did you live in? And when we ran the analyses, the striking thing that came out of this was that there was only one factor that determined whether a student would graduate in 4 years, and everything else was in the noise. And by the way, I should mention, we were not allowed, because there were lawsuits, to consider gender or ethnicity. So those were off the table and weren't part of the evaluation. But when we did the analysis, there was only one thing that made the decision, and that was how much money did your parents make? Pell-grant eligible students had maybe a 30% chance of graduating in 4 years, and the rest of the student population was double that. And that was a pretty glaring sort of thing to see. So we decided at that point that we were going to dump all of the resource we had into programs for students who fell in this category of being least likely to graduate in 4 years, knowing that it was predominantly first generation students, it was Pell-grant eligible students, it was students of color. And so what did we do with that? This is where I take a time out to just briefly tell you about something that had happened going back about 20 years. When automatic admission started at UT in the late 1990s, I was teaching a freshman chemistry course, and I'd been in the dean's office for a couple of years, but wasn't really aware of too much of what was going on. I wasn't even sure that there was such a thing as automatic admissions. But in my chemistry course I was teaching, I remember in 1998, the grade distribution just fell upside down. Instead of having a nice sort of curve, I had a lot of students who did very well, but I had this one collection of students who just flat out failed my course. And it came out of nowhere. And I did a little bit of digging in to see what it was. And I found out that for the most part, it was students who had gotten into my course as a consequence of having gotten into UT through automatic admissions. And if you went and you dug in and you looked at their backgrounds, you would see that their SAT scores were in general very weak. You would see that they had come from Title I high schools, that their preparation for and their sense of belonging to UT probably weren't so good. So I, at that point, did what in hindsight turned out to be a bit of an experiment. I wanted to create a small classroom, a small college kind of experience for this student population. So I was able to get the the provost office to give me a little bit of money to get this off the ground. It was a program that ended up being called the Texas Interdisciplinary Plan, and this is an example of that population today. But this was the TIP program, and this is what I did that first year. I identified students who were most likely not to be successful in my freshman chemistry course. And it was a very clunky sort of thing back then, looking at adversity factors. I didn't have the real data to work with, but if I had students who were Pell-grant eligible, or if I had students who were first generation, if I had students who were coming from certain high schools, and I found at least a couple of factors like that, I invited them to join the Texas Interdisciplinary Plan. And the very first population had just 50 students in it. They were all pre-health professions. And I had some rules I set up for that program. One of the rules was that there would be no remediation whatsoever, because for so many of these students, they were sent to UT and then shepherded off into programs that pretty much guaranteed that they weren't going to be part of the college and they weren't going to graduate. So when they came in, I required that they take the introductory chemistry course, the introductory biology course, and calculus, along with the course in critical thinking. And what I did was make sure that those courses were identical to the courses that were being taught in the large section. So at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I taught 500 students. And then at 3:30, I walked downstairs to a 50-student classroom and I taught those 50 students the same material. Same thing was done in biology, and the same thing was done in calculus. I was able to find faculty who were enormously committed to the success of these students. And I was lucky enough, for example, in calculus, to get the chair of the department, who himself had grown up in South Texas, to teach calculus. And he taught the accelerated calculus to these kids. And we're talking about students who had SAT scores that were a couple of hundred points below the average for the rest of the college. And yet, through the teaching that was done, through supplemental instruction that was done, through the peer mentoring that was done, through community building that was done, these students thrived. I saw that on the very first test I gave to them. The very first test I gave to them, on the same day that I gave a test to that 500 student population, they did just as well. And I thought it was such an amazing thing that all I had done was provide an environment in which they felt like they belonged, and that change happened. 4 years later, that group of 50 students graduated with a much higher four-year graduation rate than this college average. And a significant fraction of them ended up going off to medical school, something like 15 or 16 of them. And just an amazing sort of social experiment on a certain level, not really knowing the reasons why or what exactly was going on. All I knew for sure at that point was that the whole idea that you evaluate a person on the basis of an SAT score, or that you evaluate a person on the basis of how the quality of the high school they went to, that might matter on some level, but if you can put students who care into an environment in which they are allowed to feel like they belong and to thrive, then it can be made to work. So the TIP program ended up expanding substantially. There were 50 students in the first year, and it has grown to the point where there are 500 students in the program every year. They get the sorts of things that I've talked about here. And it's one of the major reasons why the graduation rates in the College of Natural Sciences effectively doubled. When I first arrived in the provost, in the dean's office, we were graduating about 1,000 students a year in our program in the college. And by the time I left, we were graduating 2,000 students in the college, not because there were more students, but because there were more students that were persisting to graduation, and in particular, the student population. Another concern I had was how to deal with financial aid. I'm not going to get into the details of financial aid, other than that it was the case that UT had certain amounts of money it had available to provide to Pell-grant eligible students in addition to their Pell-grant. And what had been done for a while was simply to give them a lump sum of money at the beginning of the year or at the beginning of the fall and spring and let it go at that. What I wanted to do was leverage that money to get these students to become more a part of the university. So I started something called the University Leadership Network. The University Leadership Network, if you looked at it and asked what it actually was, and I don't mean to be, this is just the reality of it, you take a spreadsheet and you click a button on it and you find the students least likely to graduate, And then you find the students coming from greatest economic disadvantage. And that was this population here. They had a 4-year graduation rate predicted of 33%. So I wanted to come up with something that made them feel like they were more a part of the campus. And what I did was create situations in which each of them would have internships during the time they were at UT. And there was a pretty sophisticated process for getting them involved. But those internships were within the departments all across campus. And that meant I had to reach out for what we call university partners. Would you take one of these students and let them work your front desk, or let them work doing videography in the back room? Or maybe they know, maybe they can write and you can have them do some writing, or maybe they can be a docent in a museum, or maybe they can work at health and safety because their mother or father had worked in health and safety or something like that. Whatever it was, that was the environment we created. And it was stunning how willing the university was to participate. These days, there isn't a building on campus at UT, an office on campus at UT that you walk into that you will not find a University Leadership Network student. The reason this was done is because I wanted them to feel like when the body blows of being in college happened, and they needed somebody to reach out to, that it didn't have to be somebody back home, that it didn't have to be their friends, that it could actually be somebody working on campus who would care for them and look out for them and provide a safe haven for them. The end result of that was pretty striking. That group of students found their historical average of 33% graduating in 4 years jumped to 55% in the class of 2017, and it's now up to about 65% now. It is, to me, once again, evidence that what you bring in terms of raw scores, whatever those sorts of things are, those don't matter as much as you're feeling like you're in a place that cares for you and looks out for you and makes sure that you're going to thrive. This picture right here is a picture of President Fenves at the time in 2017. This is a room right here filled with 2,000 members of the University Leadership Network there to celebrate the graduation of the first class of students. All right, so that's my first part of the talk. I want to change subjects pretty substantially here and talk about the classroom. And as I talk about the classroom, some of this is going to be a story about my own epiphany along the way. I teach large section freshman chemistry courses. And the story I'm going to tell you now is about how I've changed in the classroom, but also how for many of the faculty at UT, that change also occurred. I will also tell you that I can begin with this kind of funny little story here. I was asked to give a talk on student success at a conference put on in California. And it was a conference that was attended mostly by presidents and provosts. And each of them was given 15 minutes to stand up and talk about what they were doing on their campus to improve student success. And so it was my turn to stand up and give a talk. I was at the end of the second day, and for the entire period of time, the first day and the second day, every president and provost who stood up, they did the standard spiel about what they were doing. And when it was my turn, I stood up and said, I've been listening for 2 days to how to improve graduation rates, and I have yet to hear someone say the F word. And they were all looking at me, and I said, faculty. And there was a bit of laughter about this, but this was the truth. And I think we all appreciate this. There's this sort of very clear divide between what the faculty do and what everybody else does. And when you stop and ask yourself about that and how vital it is, it's, oh my goodness, what good does it do to create the most belonging campus you can possibly imagine if a student walks into a classroom where their likelihood of earning a passing is 50%. And so I can just tell you some horror stories at UT Austin. When I first arrived in the dean's office in natural sciences, the very first thing I was asked to deal with was a faculty member teaching a 500 student section chemistry course who had failed 95% of his students. And I found out about this because another faculty member mentioned it to me because his son was in the class. And this was back in the mid 90s, where, believe it or not, it was possible, the way the internet worked then, to put a student's grades online, put the student's name online, and put their 9-digit social security number online. So all of that was there. And I clicked and I looked at it. Sure enough, F after F after F. And I remember talking to that faculty member afterward and asked him why. And he gave me some routine about how, well, today's students aren't anywhere near as good as they used to be, even though the evidence was to the contrary. And then I went through the process of giving all the students their money back and just sort of saying, we can't have something like this. And the thing that concerned me most was this had been going on for a while. If you really want to know why most of our graduation rates were so bad, at some point, it was because in our large section, mostly math and science courses, we had huge non-passing rates. There was another incident that occurred in which a faculty member was creating a brand new calculus course that was supposed to be a course that would be of real value to students who didn't have a calculus background, but it all backfired on him. And he ended up, for various reasons, once again, not passing about 50% of the students. And then the provost got involved and asked me to do something about it in the college. So I decided to assemble all of the faculty who taught large section courses. And I invited them to lunch. And after lunch, I asked them this one question. I said, I would like you all to come up with a fraction that describes the number of students that you believe should not pass a course. Should it be 1 out of 1, 1 out of 2, 1 out of 3, 1 out of 4? What fraction of your students shouldn't pass your first year chemistry or biology or physics or calculus course? And so they all talked among each other, and then they came back pretty much all of them agreeing to the same number, somewhere between a fourth and a third. They all believe that you should not pass about 30% of your students, and that was the reality at the time. But here's the problem with that. It doesn't take a lot of calculation to appreciate the fact that if you're not passing 30% of your students in freshman math and science courses on a campus where 75% of the students are pre-med, there's no way we were going to have 70% four-year graduation rates. All it takes is one non-passing course in your first semester at UT, and your chances of graduating in 4 years plummet. So we had to do something about that. And I'll talk about that briefly in just a moment. But I also, though, want to put it in the context of what I went through, because 10 years later, suddenly I'm in the provost office, and I'm still teaching my freshman chemistry course. And it had never occurred to me that I was part of the problem. This may seem like a bizarre disconnect, but here I am. I'm an administrator, but I'm also teaching large section freshman courses, and it never stopped. And I would get my teaching awards and all, and students liked me, and I enjoyed teaching. But then I had this epiphany that occurred, and it occurred in New York City when I was asked to come there and give a talk on student success. And I was on this panel, and I was the last person on the panel to talk, and we only had 30 minutes. And by the time they got to me, there was only a couple of minutes left, and the light was flashing, and I had to say something quickly. And so I looked up, and I don't know what made me say this, but it was what was weighing on my mind, and suddenly just came out. I said, I've been teaching freshman chemistry for 20 years, 500 students in the fall and 500 students in the spring. That's 20,000 students. And I think I do a pretty good job, and I get my awards and all that. But did you know that I don't pass about 20% of my students? And so I take that 20% times 20,000, and I looked up and I said, that's 4,000 students whose hopes and dreams of becoming an engineer or a doctor or a scientist that I destroyed. And I just want to say I'm sorry. So I actually said that in this meeting, not for any other reason than I suddenly realized that I was the problem. Here I am supposedly fixing four-year graduation rates at UT Austin while doing everything I can to undermine it when I walk into a classroom. So when I got back to UT, everything changed for me in terms of how I started to think about students and their success. And it was an appreciation that this non-passing rate of 30% just couldn't be. And that what I had to do was something resembling self-centered, a student-centered instruction. So here's what happened in my class. And here's what was really important for me to understand. I took the same um, statistics package that I used to evaluate the likelihood of graduating in 4 years, and I used it to predict the likelihood of getting an A in my course. And so every one of my students in my course now had a predicted grade. And I found out, not surprisingly, that the students who came from affluence were going to get A's, and the students who came from disadvantage were going to fail. And I have been perpetuating this for years. And we as faculty always think we can get away with this because we like to be agnostic to what's happening. We want to believe that when we walk into a classroom that everybody's starting, excuse me, everybody's starting from scratch with an even playing field, when we know it couldn't be more unfair. Because the reality was that 3 weeks after I started my class, I was going to give a test that my students who weren't ready weren't going to succeed in. So this is something I had to fix. And here's what I did. And this was really a pretty remarkable transformation for myself. This is the classroom. On the first day of class, I walked out into the middle of the classroom and I stood there awkwardly in the middle and I said, I want you to know that I am on your side. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that you can succeed in this class. And I want you to look at everybody sitting next to you and promise them that you're going to do everything you can to help them succeed as well. Because my expectation should be that students earning A's in class shouldn't be a consequence of anything other than they're demonstrating a mastery of the material and a commitment not to be able to prove that they're the best compared to everybody else, but that they have in fact learned chemistry. You know, when you stop and think about it, for students who come from disadvantage, who are there basically serving as the rest of the curve so that the kids who are supposed to get A's, if I take that away from them and I say, no, all of you over on the left-hand side of the curve, you're going to be okay. You're going to do well as well. So that meant my classroom then became a very odd place. It was more about community building with all of the students helping other students succeed. And this was something that I promoted nonstop, so that on nights before tests, for example, you could go over to the libraries and you would see hundreds and hundreds of my students lying on the floor in the library, working with each other to be successful on the tests. And it was no longer a competition in that way. It meant doing everything I could to create a learning environment for the student that used technology to create an environment where they could do their learning away from the class. And then I spent the class actually teaching students how to be successful. It turns out that most students who get bad grades on tests get bad grades on tests because they don't know how to study or because they don't know how to manage their time. And so I was actually spending my time in a freshman chemistry course at UT teaching students how to get an A on a multiple choice test. That's the first lecture I gave, was how to get an A on a multiple choice test. And that mindset that said, when I walk into a classroom, everything I'm going to do is going to be about making sure that as many people can get an A on this test as possible. That was a pretty remarkable change. And what's remarkable about it is how much more willing students are to try in an environment in which their success is something that the teacher is committed to. As one piece of evidence of this, it used to be that when I was teaching this course, I was required, after students took the first exam, to send an email to all of the students who hadn't passed, telling them to come see me. And so I would send it out to the 80 or 90 passing students, and maybe one or two would respond. And I would just sort of shrug and let it go at that. Understand, I'm doing this while I'm supposed to be like the dean who cares about students. And I wasn't giving any thought to why they weren't responding. And then I realized I knew why they weren't responding. Why would they want to go and spend time sitting in a room with a scary man who had just finished failing them on a test, only to remind them that they needed to do something about that? But after that day that I walked into the middle of the classroom and I stood there and said, I'm on your side, that Sunday, after that first exam, when I emailed those 80 students, guess what? Almost all of them replied. It was the most stunning sort of change in attitude, that I was no longer that person up front who was there working against their success. I was there working for them. And this is one of the things that I would always encourage faculty to appreciate is that so much of the reason for that curve that includes those students who don't succeed has to do with the game we create in the first place that requires that that population exists that don't succeed. But if instead we change our attitude to be one in which what we do is in fact in their best interest always, then the changes in grades are going to be pretty radical. I go to a lot of trouble in this course I teach to avoid the rigid grading structures. If I have to delay tests, if I have to allow students to do makeup work, if I have to allow students to do replacement tests, I will do this. In the end, I'm only concerned that they master this material at some point. And just to give you a sense about this and how I view it, I walk into class and I tell students, I say, look, you know, our brains can only do one thing that's hard at a time. So, you know, there's your ability to do athletics really hard, like run a marathon, and there's your ability to study really hard to get a good grade on a test, and there's ability to handle the emotional challenges in your life, whether they're because of a death in the family or because of mental illness or because of financial insecurity or whatever it is. So I tell all of my students this, I say, if you aren't able to study for a test because something's getting in the way, you don't have to take it now. And I know it's more work, but it's also the way in which you end up finding it possible for students to be on a level playing field where they do have the chance to demonstrate what they're capable of achieving. And so now that that's a part of the way my course works, I watched a pretty radical change in the grades in the course. I haven't updated this in a while, but back in 2005 and 2006, I was not passing about 20% of my students. Here you see in 2014, the numbers were down to about 20. These days, there may be 3 or 4 students who don't pass my course, and I will typically give on the order of 350 to 370 A's in the course. And when people criticize this and they say, well, surely you've made the course hard, made the course easier. The answer is no. I give rigorous tests and I demand a lot of my students. And as more evidence, in fact, of the fact that my course is actually benefiting them than not. Students who take my course end up graduating at higher rates than students in other chemistry courses. So clearly it's possible for a student to be able to do well in a course where everybody around them is doing well, and it doesn't ultimately fall apart because they hit organic chemistry the next semester. Now, as I said, I wasn't the only one to engage in this effort. And so as an example, the course transformation projects that were created at UT, first in 2011, when I was in the dean's office in natural sciences, got the faculty teaching in the large lower division courses to come together and with a little bit of support from a technology perspective and a little bit of graduate student support to help transform the courses, they ended up creating very different environments for their students. And so this data right here is the data that is actually the real reason why 4-year graduation rates improved at UT Austin. What had at one time been 30 to 50% 4-year graduation rates, and we're now 20% 4-year graduation rates, dropped to less than 10%. There are the chemistry graduation rates. Look at biology, their graduation rates went down, their non-passing rates went down to 5 or 6%. Statistics, they went down to 4 or 5%. All of this because the faculty reimagined ways of teaching in which the students would be successful. So for the class of 2017 that was graduating, notice the percentage of hours failed had dropped to 1%. I can tell you that in the College of Natural Sciences last year, out of 2,500 incoming freshmen, 3 went on academic probation. I mean, it's just become almost an unheard of process for a student not to succeed. Here are the non-passing rates in large courses last year. Calculus down to 4% non-passing after at one time being over 50%. Those results combined with what we did in terms of student belonging took our scores from somewhere in the 50, 51, 52% up to 69.8% last year. And this in the year, I'm sorry, in 2018, and last year in 2019, the numbers I think rose to about 71 or 72%. As Sarah pointed out, the real plus in all of this is what happened in terms of closing the gaps for students who have different SAT quartiles. So notice that in 2012, this huge gap in terms of graduation rates and persistence for the top and bottom quartile based on SAT, and look at the gap in 2017. And more importantly, just in terms of persistence, here are the four-year graduation rate numbers for Latinx and African-American students, growing from 40% to 60%. The Pell-grant eligible numbers, the first generation numbers, again, from 40% to 60%. This is the real success story, is that whatever was done on campus, whether it was the way the faculty taught in the classrooms or the way that students were made to feel as if they belonged through all of the non-academic programs that were made available, that is where the big difference occurred. Those changes that you saw taking us from 50% to 70% plus are actually, if you dug away and looked underneath it all, those students who at one point, one would have said were least likely to succeed, and now they're succeeding at rates that are on par with all of the rest of the students. So anyway, that's the message. And as I tell you this story, I can't tell you how proud I am of UT for what it did. It certainly wasn't me. It was this large collection of people who rallied around the idea that if you change the message and the culture and the learning environment, that you could radically change the environment for the students in terms of being successful. So that's my presentation. And at this point, I'll turn it back over to Sarah. As always, I run long on these sorts of things, and I'm happy to field any questions.
Thank you, David, so much. This was excellent. I really appreciate your details and the challenge and inspiration for the work that can be done to improve student success. So thank you so much for the excellent presentation. I'm sure lots of our attendees are clapping in their homes right now, even though we don't have that modality enabled for everyone. We do have a couple questions that came in. I know some people might need to jump off for 12 o'clock meetings, but I thought we'd take a little time to answer some of the questions. The first one comes from Professor Mankey, one of our chemists, and he asks, the four-year graduation rate was a mandate, and it is a reasonable metric for measuring success, but are there other metrics you feel are a better measure for success?
You know, that's an interesting question. Well, here's one. It would be nice if they could get jobs. Here's a measure of success. Does a university like UT Austin, away from its business school, away from its engineering programs, away from computer science, where students are pretty much guaranteed to get a job when they graduate. I don't think that, especially for students who are told that you need to go to college because that's how you get ahead in the world, that 4 years later you have your degree and yet you don't have that next step into a fulfilling career. So this may be slightly off the mark from what was being asked from an academic perspective, but I really do think that universities should do a much, much better job, certainly UT, of making it possible for a student to get that handshake out into the career that's going to provide them with a sense of fulfillment, a career that's going to make them feel as if they have a purpose in their lives. I would prefer that as the best measure of success. I should also mention that I understand that four-year graduation rates carries with it a lot of baggage. Students who decide to do a second major, students who decide to study abroad, students who, because of financial situations, just aren't in a position to be able to complete. And I understand that. And so for them, and by the way, you should appreciate, there was never this idea that you had to force a student to graduate. They graduated because they wanted to graduate. They graduated because it made sense to graduate. And so for the 30% for whom there were other good reasons not to, that was perfectly acceptable. I would hate to think that there was ever this absolute mandate, and I wouldn't favor a situation where a student is told you must graduate in 4 years or else.
Great, thank you for that. Next question is actually from our provost, Greg Camfield. He asks, how do we change the faculty's culture so that commitment to student success is the default rather than the exception?
You may wonder how UT did it, and I don't have an answer that you may want to hear. The reality is that when I arrived at UT 30 years ago, I was pretty much told by every faculty member there that it was our job to protect higher education from students who didn't deserve to be in it. That it was our job to keep a student from getting a chemistry degree or a math degree who didn't deserve to get that degree. And so that was the mindset of many of the tenure track faculty who taught courses. They made it a point to teach in a way that would separate the students in this way. Now it's not like that. Now most of our students thrive in the introductory courses. And what's the primary thing that changed? For the most part, it's that we now have mostly faculty who are not on the tenure track lines teaching in those courses. I'm one of the rare faculty members teaching a large section course, not the only one. There are still some out there like this, but I think a lot of the big change was that faculty whose focus was on student success and on teaching replaced the faculty who might have in the past not been so committed. Now, also having said that, I will tell you this, there was a genuine effort on the part of Bill Powers when he was president to put a commitment to making sure that part of your consideration for tenure was quality teaching. The School of Undergraduate Studies was created, and the dean of the School of Undergraduate Studies was actually put on the university's promotion and tenure committee. Up until that point, it had been a grand total of 4 people there. I think there was the provost, the president, the vice president for research, and maybe one other person. But suddenly there was somebody in that room who, when a faculty member had bad teaching evaluations or a letter had been written on their behalf that suggested they were a great teacher, despite all evidence to the contrary, he was willing to stand up and call that bluff. And I think over several years, beginning first with Paul Woodruff, who was the first undergraduate studies dean, and the current one, Brent Iverson, they got the message out through the president's office, down to the provost, down to the deans, to let the departments know that the gig was up, that they weren't going to be allowed to get a person through and promoted to tenure unless they demonstrated a commitment to a variety of things, whether it was to excellence in teaching or a commitment to diversity. Those were things that were now, for the first time ever, I think, something that people took seriously. It did not come quickly. And in fact, it came with a lot of the faculty who had been problematic in terms of their teaching, retiring or being removed from the teaching ranks.
Thank you, David. Since we have some people who will need to jump off, I wanted to share where you're going to have some small group conversations with David if you'd like to continue the conversation and learn more. We have a few group topics. I'll throw, actually, Maggie, could you throw the link to the Zooms for this afternoon in the chat? So if you're interested in talking about medical education and David's expertise there, we'll be meeting at 12:15. 12:45, we'll be talking about early undergraduate research experiences. 1:15, we'll be talking about his work with UTeach, which is a teacher preparation program. 2 o'clock, we talk about the use of analytics and institutional data. And then finally at 2:30, we'll be talking about course redesign and working with faculty development for student success. So Maggie will hopefully throw that link in the chat if you're interested in joining one of those conversations to continue talking with David. I thought we'd end with just 2 more questions that have come in the chat. One is from our Dean of Natural Sciences, Betsy Dumont. Where can we learn more about how you transformed your classroom?
I guess you could ask me. It's an interesting thing, and thank you for asking about it. I view my chemistry class, which I've been teaching now for 25 years, as my hobby. It's really pretty pathetic, but it's what I love to make better. And whether it was the flipping of the classroom in the year 2001, when I held a Sony Handycam in front of my face and made 1,000 5-minute video clips that I put on YouTube, or the subsequent versions of the class flipping, or whether it was the time that I spent just really sitting with students and asking, why didn't you get this question right? It's remarkable how when your focus becomes on what you need to do to make it possible for a student to succeed, that things really change. And And so for me, it continues to be an evolutionary process in terms of what I'm doing to try to make it possible for students to be successful. Even in times like this with COVID, I've learned ways during COVID to really improve substantially my way of interfacing with students. To know that I'm giving a test at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning and at 11 o'clock on Monday night, 250 students are sitting in chat rooms with me and with other students studying. It's been really a positive experience, but I'm happy to share, for example, I'll send you my how to get an A on a multiple choice test that is my reverse engineering and of how you go about doing that. I mean, if you stop and think about it, isn't it kind of funny? You walk into class and say, I'm not going to teach you any chemistry because I've got that all online, but I'm going to tell you how it is you get an A on a multiple choice test by sort of letting you know what we do to try to keep you from getting an A on a multiple choice test. That's what happens when you're on this side. You're no longer trying to play gotcha with them. You're actually trying to play, I really hope you will succeed. And it's a world of difference.
Thank you, David. A quick one from our Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs. Are there specific tools being used, Charles Neese, are there specific tools being used to measure sense of student belonging on your campus?
So the answer is yes. There are a variety of different measures that are used, and I've now been away from the provost office for 4 years now, and so I'm not familiar with those or what the VPSA are now using. But we absolutely ask of our students for input on their sense of belonging, and I can tell you, in particular, what's happened over the last couple of years because of some of the really terrible things happening in society is that there has been a profound commitment to giving students a voice with respect to representing what they think is necessary for them to be successful. And as an example, when COVID hit, the students were the ones who ended up driving a sense on the part of the president and the provost about what the effective way was to respond. So I think actually opening our ears to listen to what the students have to say and being committed to responding to that is something that has never happened before, and something that I think that is a real positive. But the answer is yes, there are lots of surveys done on students' sense of belonging.
Well, thank you so much, David. And I think we'll end there because I know folks may have other meetings. We want to give you a little break before the small group conversations. Again, the schedule is up there if you'd like to connect further with David during his visit today. We also hope to have David to the campus sometime in the near future, back when travel is more open. So we're hoping to have him as a visitor on campus in the near future to continue to help inform our work around student success, given the strong successes we saw at UT Austin today.
But Sarah, UT Modesto was supposed to happen out in Crow's Landing. It's going to be a bitter thing for me to walk onto your campus. I'll do it, but I'm still going to be kind of sad.
I think when you see our campus, it's gorgeous, and you'll see that they made a great decision to land us in Merced.
Don't you think that a campus in Crow's Landing just north of Modesto wouldn't have been even just as lovely?
Well, if we can get him over the bitterness and get him to come to Merced,
I'll come.
Get him here soon.
That'll be fine.
All right. Thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. Have a good rest of your day.